by your employer. But equally, what actually helped workers in the 19th century was that they developed rights, I'm talking about, like the right not to be fired at will. They developed powers that came with the right to unionize and organize. Because once you had unions, that was their initial rationale, was to protect workers. There was a countervailing power against the power of the employer. And thirdly, the worker would need options. You get options only insofar as there is a system of social security that means that being unemployed does not necessitate destitution. You can be unemployed without being destitute. So you've got an option to employment. I give those two examples as cases where civic republicanism would argue, say in the cause of women and workers, for a strongly entrenched form of freedom in these respects. That's probably the best I can do in these few short moments to explain what I mean by freedom as non-domination and to show you why it's a richer demand than freedom just as non-interference. The nice husband, the nice employer will give you freedom as non-interference. He may be nice only because you ingratiate yourself with him, but he does give you freedom as non-interference. He does not give you freedom as non-domination. He can't give you freedom as non-domination unless you've got the extra powers and the options that I've talked about in the case of these two examples. So that's the freedom ideal. I said I'd say a little bit more about it, and that's all I'm going to say about it. So let us turn very finally and very quickly, I'm just about out, to the issue of how government should conduct itself in order that its interference in people's lives, even when it's designed to protect them against domination, is not itself a source of domination. You need a state that's strong enough to protect people, but that itself is so disciplined, so regulated, so controlled by the citizenry that it's not an alien power, an external power in their lives. Well, there are some elements that are clearly important, and they're obvious, but let me just spell them out. One is, clearly you need a rule of law, ideally for the common good. Clearly you need election to office, periodic election, there can't be indefinite terms of office, and ideally you need rotation in office. It has to be the case that a number of parties alternate in power so as to check one another over time. Clearly and very importantly, you need a separation and a sharing of functional powers. So, for example, the judiciary must be independent from the legislature / executive. And within the legislature, there need to be bodies that can, again, check and count and balance one another. You need transparency in government so that we know what's going on, and you need the ability to contest government. To contest government in the parliament, in the press, via the ombudsmen, via various offices of complaint, in the courts, of course, and also, if necessary, on the streets. You need a citizenry that are aware of what's happening in government and that keep that check on government. Democracy doesn't begin or end with elections. Elections are only a small part of the democratic protections that I think of as the mixed constitution package. There's got to be a continuous checking and balancing of government, both within itself and in relation to the citizenry. In this sort of interaction, we all want unity to emerge. The state has to emerge as a body that speaks for the people as a whole, but it's got to be a pluribus unum in the Latin phrase. It's got to be unity, a union out of many elements that balance and check one another and that ultimately make a place for one another and respect one another. Now that's all very brief, and it's almost like slogans, and I do apologize for that, but the time sort of makes it difficult to do much else, and I've got a dominus here in my life who's imposing his will, I'm sure, not arbitrarily. Let me finish, though, with just reference to Spain, for example, today, and the situation that we see in your wonderful country. It's very important for the enjoyment of non-domination in Spain today, and I've elaborated this in the book Examena Zapatero, that you've got an infrastructure that's operating well of non-domination, as I call it. Now, for such an infrastructure, you have to have a fairly prosperous ongoing economy. That's a necessity. We've learned that. You can't just operate a satisfactory polity, a republican polity, state, except on the basis of an economy that's open and that's working well. That's part of the infrastructure. Equally part of the infrastructure is a world in which children are educated properly and to the fullest possible degree so as to take their part. Educated in civic terms, but equally in scientific and technological terms, in terms that are relevant to the economy. And of course, government can do a lot about getting this infrastructure to work well, but it can't do everything. The economy and education is as much in the hands of the people themselves, individually, in families, in churches and so on, for example, as it is in the hands of government. There has to be a system of law that allows people access to justice. That means the